there's people that, they withdraw their pieces, and I just don't really believe in that. I said, that's who you were when you were that age. Or maybe you were a little older and you had a piece that you didn't like, but you want to withdraw. No, that's who you were. Maybe you were going through a difficult time, or maybe you didn't have time to write the piece, but that was you. That's the truth. That was you in 2020. That was you in 2018, whatever. Like, that was you, and that's the truth. And I really believe in that. Or maybe I'll shoot myself in the foot if I withdraw one of my pieces. Hi, everybody. We're back here. This is Sofia Ouyang. She is a current undergraduate, right, at Juilliard, studying composition. Who are you studying with?
Andrew Norman.
Andrew Norman. Okay. But Andrew's not going to be there next year, right?
Yeah.
And what year are you in right now?
I'm a third year undergrad, Columbia Juilliard. And so I'm mainly at Columbia, actually. I'm pursuing a philosophy major at Columbia.
So the degree, so I misspoke before. So you are doing your degree at Columbia, full degree, but then you're doing lessons at Juilliard, right?
Yeah, so essentially it's like an exchange program. I don't get a degree from Juilliard, but I get to go to Juilliard once a week or twice a week. I have a private lesson. I go to the composer forums, and I get to sort of participate in the composer opportunities at Juilliard.
Dang, okay. So how did you even find out about that you could even do something like this?
Honestly, I kind of stumbled upon it. I was doing composition very amateurly starting around middle school, and then at 16 I went to Curtis Summerfest, which was like my first music festival ever. I was also living in China, so I didn't really have a music community, and I didn't know any other young composers. So going to that festival, that was sort of where I met other composers for the first time. I met professional composers, and then I heard about all those opportunities and programs for college. And so really I only had like 2 years from high school to college kind of deciding, I do want to do composition, but I also want to do other things. So that's sort of how I ended up.
It's so
here.
crazy with composition, because I feel like the same thing when I was in high school. I had no idea that any of this was possible, but then I was like injected into a program where it was like, wait,
Right.
What is this world? And I feel like violinists, pianists, and people like that, people that play instruments at a high level, they know about this world from a very, very young age, that composers just don't. And I just don't really understand how that's still a thing.
I know.
now.
It's definitely, I don't know. I feel like, for me growing up, especially in Western classical music, it feels, the composer feels very much like this authority from the past, and the idea that that was still something people are doing is just not, I didn't realize that until really kind of by chance stumbling upon it.
So you growing up, you said you grew up in China?
Yes.
So growing up in China, you were playing an instrument, I'm assuming.
Piano. I don't think I was playing in in the direction of concert pianist. I was very I don't practice a lot, but honestly composing is really good for me. I love the flexibility of sort of, you can choose when you do it, and then there's just so much, I feel like there's so much more freedom for me. It just really suits my personality.
So when you got into the 2016 festival, the Curtis Summerfest, actually one of my other students, she also did Curtis Summerfest, but I think later than you. I don't think 2016. I think maybe a couple years after that. She was telling me that it was just like the most amazing program she met. So the people that she met there, she's still in touch with them now, and I'm assuming you have a similar experience. But then how did you find out about that to begin with? If you were in China and then you don't know if you want to be a composer, you're just kind of dabbling in it, I'm assuming. How did you even find that opportunity to begin with?
It was really random. It was like, I think I should do a summer festival now. I'm going to college soon.
Yeah.
And then, I'm doing composition, and let's search up all those like schools with big names and see if they have summer festival. It was really like that. And I have no idea what I was doing. But after that, I had an idea like, that was actually super cool. Yeah.
What was the experience at Curtis Summerfest that made you think, like, I can do this, I can be a composer?
Right. I think exposure was key to me. Exposure to peer composers, that was actually a really big deal, to realize that it's not just something that people do amateurly, but it's something that people my age take seriously and are interested in pursuing as even a career. Like, there's some people as young as when I was 16, like they were around my age and they knew they wanted to do it. And obviously I didn't know, but that was really inspirational. And I think it was also sort of getting the perspective of mentors, and I feel like in a way maybe some of them saw potential in me, so there was like a trust from them, and there was my trust in them, and sort of having them give comments to me and things like that. And then it was also hearing my piece played by professional musicians for the first time, and that was, I think it was all of those elements, and being in a very purely musical environment for 3 weeks straight, and that's something I've never had before. And that was a feeling I really enjoyed. It was like community, so all of that together made me kind of starting to consider.
I think that's a big thing you mentioned about having your music played by professional musicians, because I was always, at least for me, since I was 8, I wanted to be a composer.
Wow.
But I never heard any of my music played professionally until I was 15. And looking back on it, that's like actually pretty good. You know, some people don't, it takes them even years after that to hear. But other than that, I was just having my music played by my friends, which is great. But when you hear your music played by a professional ensemble, or even just one professional person, you just think to yourself, wow, like, you know, you're just kind of shocked at how the music sounds, because oftentimes it sounds better than it sounded like in your head.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the experience I had growing up, and it reminds me a lot of that. So you did the Curtis Summerfest 2016, and then how soon after that did you have to apply to college?
So I actually did it 2018, and I was 16 at the time. So 2 years after that.
Okay, so I have the numbers mixed up.
No.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so that was 2 years before COVID, actually. So
Okay.
I did one more festival, 2019, and then 2020, COVID. Also, my high school graduation was that same year. And then I came to college. The first year was all remote. But then, yeah, that's sort of where I was at.
So the first year you went to college at Columbia, it was all
Yes.
remote. So that was
2020
fall
to 2021.
Fall 2020 is when you entered. Wow. And going into college, so like figuring out where you wanted to go into college, obviously you're not majoring in music, you're majoring in something entirely different. But were you thinking that way when you applied to school?
Totally. I was applying mostly to universities, and universities with dual degree programs like Columbia Juilliard, because I feel like I've always really been interested in other subjects, especially literature and philosophy. So I wanted to pursue that in undergrad. I wanted to be in an environment where there are sort of people with a lot of different interests and specializing in different things, and also like figuring out their life directions with many choices, I guess. And I wanted music to be the most important part, or if not the more important part. So dual degrees or exchange programs worked really well for me, and it's working really well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember because I'm bringing this up because I actually also applied to this Columbia Juilliard exchange program, and I'm from Los Angeles, so I don't know if you know, but people from Los Angeles, they either want to go to two places. They want to go to the Bay Area for college, or they want to go to New York, and that's it. That's all I hear. That's like the stereotype.
Yeah.
And I had no interest to go to the Bay Area, but I wanted to go to New York. So I applied to that program. I got in, and then realized that they didn't have any funding or anything like this. I don't know how it was for you, but I was just really ticked off, because I thought, wow, like if you get into a program like this, it sounds so selective, but then there's no funding. So there was kind of a mental disconnect.
See.
And then USC, which is in my backyard in LA. And at the time, I remember thinking that this is not that exciting to go to college there, because it's just basically like 20 minutes away from my high school. You know, what sort of adventure is that? But I turned out to be dead wrong, and they gave me a full scholarship.
Wow.
And I ended up going to Juilliard.
I know. I was
for
going to
my
say
master's,
and then Columbia.
And now I'm at Columbia for my doctorate. So it feels like a fairy tale.
It's like a round
it ended up being those three schools. It just took a little longer for that to happen. So I haven't met many. I don't think I'm sure I've met people that done the exchange program, but I haven't met composers for sure that have done the exchange program. So I'm always wonder, like, what is your life like right now in terms of balancing all that stuff? Because at least when I was at USC, I only did composition. I didn't major in anything else. I figured, you know what, I got my full ride. I don't got to do anything else that my parents want me to do. I can do the composition. I'm going to be a rebel and just focus on that. And I haven't done anything else. But you are doing other things. So,
yeah, I mean, I feel like, it's a slight trade-off because obviously you spend more time doing other things as well as music. But for me, it works really well because I feel like my music and how I approach music is very concept and thought based. And so I'm really interested in also just taking in more knowledge from different fields and maybe different frameworks and different ways of approaching things and perspectives and putting that into my music because I feel like composition for me is just a medium that I happen to have the grammar in. And I'm really interested, what I am interested in is creating and making things and thinking about things and sort of assembling, disassembling things. So having philosophy, even though it's not like learning that, even though it's not like directly related to what I'm doing right now in music, it's something that I want to sort of accumulate. And it also just really sparks my interests doing that stuff. But obviously Columbia is notorious for the core curriculum and there is just so much work. All of my friends are constantly in the library, me too. And then like at final season, like the Butler library is just packed with all-nighters. Well, that's an exaggeration, but like it's a lot of things constantly. And yeah, it's, obviously that takes away from how much I can do musically and how much I can learn and grow in that realm. So I feel like maybe I'll need a few more years after undergrad to kind of almost like catch up in a way, but not quite, because I feel like everyone is in a different, goes in a different speed and tempo in sort of how they grow as a composer.
yeah, that's the thing about composing. It takes, even I saw there's this announcement with the LA Phil, and they announced Timo Andrus as a young composer. Said the guy is like 40 years old, right? I'm pretty sure he's not my age. I'm 30, and maybe I'm still considered a young composer, but definitely I would hope by 40 I'm not considered a young composer. Yeah. So it does take time to develop as your voice. That being said, Timo, his voice is developed, definitely, but there's no rush for a composer, I feel like, to be a star or anything like this. And in fact, you want the opposite. You want it to grow organically over time. But the problem with that, the flip side is if you're doing that, which is a more healthy way, I think, to approach it, then the issue of money comes into play because until you reach that upper stratosphere of composers, those are the only ones really making a living from it. There's this whole infrastructure of composers that are really great, really talented. They're writing into their 40s, their 50s, but they're not making much money from their commissions themselves. So I think it's really great to do something else on the side or your main thing because it just gives you more inspiration to do the composition. It doesn't put so much pressure to always be composing all the time and, oh my God, I need to make money from this piece or I'm not going to eat. Like that's a lot of pressure for someone to be just composing all the time. So I think what you're doing, it's interesting. I always wonder if I did something like that for my undergrad because I never had a fallback. I just did composition.
Right. Yeah, no, I think to an extent I really like the fact that composing as a career is sort of this progression upward. You keep accumulating, you keep growing as a composer. But of course, like there's also, as you say, the slight downside of maybe, it's like not very financially stable for the majority of people in the field. And I don't know, I guess like I'm very much still coming from the student in the educational institution side of things where I'm like, what is this going to be for me? But I think it's also interesting that like people have different careers in composition. Like some people do side jobs, like you say, and then some people are doing full-time composing. And then there's like different forms of compositions that they focus on. All of that's like I think that's interesting for me. Like there's so much freedom in what you can do in this career.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's a work in progress for sure, and everybody has a different path to it. And there's also these valleys and and these peaks and things like that when you're pursuing a career in this. That's just what it is when you're living like kind of a freelance life. I want to go to one of your pieces because you just immediately when you talking about literature, humanities, things like this, your piece Return to Root, it reminds me of a lot of this stuff because it's for flute, voice, percussion, electronics, and also video. So let's listen and watch some of that right now. So I noticed right off the bat with this piece that you use a lot of different vocal things in the flute writing, the voice writing, and it's also like extremely composed, meaning like, I mean, everything is so written out like for the first few minutes. And unless you listen to the entire piece, you're not going to know what I'm talking about next. But like the next few pages of the score are like completely aleatoric, but not really because you give really clear instructions. And that produces a whole different vibe that I didn't expect. And then like the last part of the piece, sorry, I'm summarizing the whole piece, but listen to the whole thing. The last part of the piece is just like a bunch of goose eggs, just a bunch of whole notes. And it's just like the most bare that you can make it. And to me, I like that playing with my expectations, because when I look at the first few pages of the score, even when I'm listening to it, I just expect it to be like this the whole way through. But the fact that you're taking things away as you're going through the whole piece, I mean, it reminds me a lot that you're thinking of things other than music and I'm wondering if that's true or if I'm just making things up.
No, totally, like very on point. Yeah. I mean, that piece, I was very fortunate to have been able to write that piece and have it performed at National Sawdust, which is a venue in Brooklyn and has so much different multimedia elements to it. There's like lovely, great lighting. There's this audio system that I was able to adjust the reverb of the room in the beginning and in the end. And there's like this big difference. Like the ending has this church reverb and the beginning's a lot more dry. So all of that hardware was also kind of factored into my creative decisions to some extent. But that piece is in dialogue with a poem I wrote in 2019 called the same name, Return to Root. And the reason that I was sort of interested in having that dialogue with this poem was because the poem is sort of about this singular leaf drifting in autumn wind. And I talk about how it's like returning to root. It's going to go to the land. It's going to land on the dirt eventually, but then it's wilted, and so it can't really return to root. Like the return is not granted in a way. So I guess what I was interested in is that when I first wrote it, I thought about having this poem represent this wavering between cultures and the sense of cultural identity that is not stable, that is not secure. And that's how I felt to some extent. You know, I'm Chinese American, but I grew up in China and all of that. But then when I reread the poem in 2020 during the height of the COVID pandemic, I had a different interpretation of the poem that I wrote. And it was this sense of this individual helplessly kind of trapped in this larger society. And that being the fact that you cannot really control these external factors to you, and you're sort of propelled by things, you're driven by the wind. So what I was really interested in was the fact that I'm able to have different interpretations of a poem I wrote. And that sort of drove me to think of the different ways in which meaning can be transfigured and understood in a piece of art. So that's sort of what I did with this piece. Was I wanted to use different elements in the piece to reinterpret the poem. And so like the notation, the differences in notation throughout the piece was part of that attempt to kind of layer my dialogue with the poem. And so I guess like it's sort of a comment on, or like my exploration on what meaning can be in art. But also there's a lot of relevance to the representational aspect of the poem. Like I had the flutist and the vocalist utter different words and phonemes from the poem in the first section that we just heard. And then later on, there are kind of fragments of it coming back, especially in the electronic section later. And so, yeah, there's sort of like a lot of layers happening at once in this piece.
I also like the very personal touch to it, because I feel like a lot of music that, at least that I encounter, doesn't really have that. I mean, I think it's really important because you're putting a stamp on why you're writing music in the first place. Because if you don't do that, I feel like what's the point? Because there are so many other things one can do in the day.
Yeah.
But you making the poem, first of all, I would never do something like that. I am so bad with my words, especially writing them down. But you doing that is a brave thing to begin with, and then looking back on it several years later, and then seeing, okay, this is how I wrote it to begin with, but then this is how I want to interpret it later. I think it's interesting. I feel like the same way when I listen to older pieces of mine. You know, I listen to it, I'm like, what? I wish I did this, or I wish I did that with it. But doing it with a poem, I think, makes more sense, because you can really be more abstract with how you're interpreting it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like even like this idea of looking into a past record of yourself, and even like looking at maybe like things you've said before that you recorded from years ago, you're like, oh, this is me, but this is also not me. Like there's a very uncanny feeling. And I'm really interested in things like that, you know, reinterpreting and kind of layering your current thoughts and subjective state into your past subjective. So like this whole thing about what is the self and like how does it change over time? It's very philosophy based, but
it's interesting, I think it's too, relevant, because
yeah.
You're dealing with identity, but it's not purely, you know, on the surface. Yeah, you're Chinese American, especially that you grew up in China. That's a very different experience than myself, because I was born and grew up in the U.S. Although a lot of my music is directly talking about Arab music. At least this particular piece, it seems that it's dealing with identity, but it's not purely about that you're Chinese American. I mean, it's not just about that. There is another layer to it that you're trying to explore.
Yeah, I think I tend to kind of try to abstract a little bit and zoom out in terms of perspective. Like I like doing that a lot when I think about things. And also for this poem, I suppose it's more abstract. You know, it's about a leaf. It's not about a more specific identity, let's say.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, listening to this piece is so fully formed, and you're so young. I'm like thinking back when I was writing. To be quite honest with you, a lot of the pieces I wrote during my undergrad, like those pieces don't get played. And actually, I did have one of my undergrad pieces when I was like maybe 19 years old, get played at a recent Columbia Composers concert.
Wow.
And actually, maybe you were there. Maybe you were. It was a piece for electric guitar and keyboard and saxophone and percussion. And it was a riot, because it was just like this very pop-oriented thing that I don't do at all anymore. And people were so shocked, but it was like, well, that was me 10 years ago, you know?
Right.
It's just completely different. So I wonder what it will be like for you 10 years down the road, looking back on this piece. I wonder if you would take the poem again and do something else with it. You
That's a
know,
great idea.
I just wonder because it's taking this extra musical thing and doing something different with it. I just wonder what that would be like. So, great. So you wrote that piece, and you wrote that piece last year, right, or 2 years ago?
Yes, it was 2022.
So 2022. Okay. So you're writing this piece. You're at Juilliard. Now I had Tyson Davis on the show, and he writes very different from you, aesthetically speaking. To me, and this is something we talked about on the show, it's more in line, I think, with what Juilliard is known for, kind of more neoclassical, neo-romantic tradition, things like that. And you definitely don't write that way. And I'm wondering, what is it like for you, like in that community? You're not there all the time. I understand that, but you are. I'm assuming you go to seminar.
Yes.
Every week, and you have lessons, and you hear the other pieces being played. I don't know what it's like now, but I'm just wondering, what is it like to be writing in that kind of style? Are there other people writing in that style? Is it just you? Are you? I mean, I'm just wondering because I felt kind of a similar way when at Juilliard. I was writing in a very different style, and I was getting even more and more like closer to like probably what Columbia does.
Yeah.
While I was at Juilliard, and I could definitely feel like that it was just a different feeling. So I wonder what it is for you.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, no, I think I definitely feel like maybe overall, like I don't, not that I really know what my style is. I'm still very much like figuring that out. But I do feel like maybe the majority of people, I definitely don't feel a sense of similarity in how we approach, not how we approach music, but just sort of the kind of music that we end up writing. It's interesting, but it's also, I go there once or twice a week. So even that gives me that slightly outside perspective that I actually really enjoy because I've always, I grew up a little bit like this. I'm Chinese American. I grew up in China. My mom grew up in the States. So there's sort of different cultural influences. And I felt like a slight outsider as well, like throughout my life, but in a really good way. I feel like I'm able to, now that I'm in the States, I'm able to have a slight distance from the culture because I don't feel like I fully am in the culture. And I'm able to, in a way, be a little more critical, but not in a sort of critical way, just observant and sort of see how things are. And that's how I feel about being at Juilliard as well. The fact that I'm not always there and I'm able to be out of there and then go to this other school, which I'm also able to get out of and go to the other school. So, this like wavering back and forth. And I think I've always really enjoyed that. Going back to return to root, this idea of having a root, having a home, having like either a culture or like a city where you can call home for sure. I don't need that. Like, I feel like I'm not someone that wants that kind of stability or need that kind of stability. I'm very much someone who enjoys wavering and being somewhere and then being somewhere else.
That's interesting. That's a good way to put it too. I like that answer. Because when I was at Juilliard, it was the opposite feeling. I'm like, I was there all the time. Actually, I was in the dorms for a year and a half, so I was like there.
The
all
dorms.
The time, I was there. I was with the undergrads. I was eating in the cafeteria. Yeah. I had the full-on Juilliard experience, and to me, I mean, it was amazing. But to me, I feel like if I was there for any longer than 2 years, it would have been too much.
Yeah.
Because it was just so much Juilliard all the time. And being at Columbia, it's kind of like if you do a doctorate somewhere, it's like the opposite situation because you're there doing a doctorate, but you're also not really there because you don't have that many classes. You might be teaching, but not that much. So you kind of have this space where you can kind of really find your voice. And I feel like at Columbia during my doctorate, that's where I really felt like, okay, I can do whatever I want without like having like all these people around all the time, like always saying, oh, what are you writing? Oh, what are you doing? Oh, what is this? And I'm like, I want to tell you, but I also don't want to tell you. Not because I don't want to share. It's just because I'm still trying to figure things out.
Yeah, I know. It's like Juilliard is even architecturally, it's like a one building, it's like, at least Columbia, we have a campus. But I certainly feel, well, I'm not fully there once again, so I don't know what that's like, but I feel like Juilliard, because it's only students of performing arts, there's a sense that what you're doing as a performing artist, whether you're a composer or a violinist, that's sort of a big part of your identity and why you're at Juilliard. So I think that's something that maybe leads to certain psychologies when like I ask somebody else like, oh, like what are you writing, and then somebody else asks me that, and there's a slight like, but like I'm more than this, you know. At least that's what I feel. I could feel if I were sort of fully there.
That's exactly how it was. Like when you look at your friends or you look at, you know, players, it's almost like a transaction. Like I see them only as a violinist, or I see them only as a composer. And, you know, a lot of that was my fault because I also was viewing myself that way. Like I'm only here for 2 years and, you know, I feel like I have to make the most out of it. And the only way I'm going to make the most out of it is if I just act like a composer all the time. I'm writing all the time. I'm asking people to play my stuff all the time, bothering people in the practice rooms. Hey, can you play this lick? Can you play it? So they only see you as a composer. And that's how I saw myself for a long time. But going to Columbia actually got me out of that. I said, okay, I don't have to be in composing mode all the time. And doing this thing is part of that. Also, it's an extension of that. Like, what else could I do? Like, I'm not just a composer. Like, that's almost boring in a way because most of the time what we do is not that exciting. We're just sitting alone back there. That's where I write, and you know, just alone and trying to figure things out. And that's not a good way to grow, I think, either. If you're on your own all the time, like growing is part of being a community. And it took me a long time to figure that out. Actually, I just kind of figured that out in the last couple of years, really.
Wow.
So it's been a journey for me. So I'm just very interested to see how kind of the next, I consider you guys like the next generation because I feel like you guys grew up in a completely different environment than I grew up in, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I was, my first time touching a computer, I was like 6, which I mean, I feel like even that makes me old now. That sounds kind of late,
actually.
Yeah, I know, because I was born in 2001, and I know I've seen people, maybe like parents, friends, kids who are like 5 or so years younger than me, and they had like an iPad at 3 or something. And I remember like when I was 8, I was like, huh, that's weird. But yeah, I'm almost like a 0.5 generation before that complete like computer technology generation, like start infiltration.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Time. Yeah.
And it also depends how your parents raised you too. Like if you didn't touch a computer till you were 6, that you know, your parents like kept you away from that stuff.
I mean, it was like a giant, big, you know, like those computers.
Yeah.
It's like a desktop computer.
Yeah, because I was like 7 when I first touched a desktop computer.
Oh,
for sure.
Interesting.
And I was born in '92, so they just started coming out. But they didn't think it would be this addictive thing at that time. It was like a tool. There wasn't really like internet.
Yeah.
Like in a standard way. It was still like dial-up internet. You probably didn't have to.
No, not that. Yeah, I definitely had.
Yeah, so we didn't have this like addictive nature to it. But I was like using Sibelius from like when I was like 11, 12 years old. I remember, you know, having the pirated Sibelius thing.
Me too. Actually,
I pay for it now. I paid a subscription. Don't sue me.
Yeah, middle school me was like pirated Sibelius.
Yeah. But you still use Sibelius now?
I still use Sibelius. Yeah.
So I'm still a dinosaur too, using Sibelius.
I know.
It seems everybody went off to Dorico.
I know. Yeah.
But speaking of that, I know Dorico is really good with a lot better than Sibelius with microtones and quarter tones. But you wrote a piece relatively recently called Insects for string quartet. Let's listen to that. It has a bunch of quarter tones. Yeah, when I'm hearing this piece, it's so different than the Return to Root piece, because the Return to Root piece is more about timbre, more about this relationship with this extra musical thing in the poem. Insects, obviously, you can't help when you're listening to the piece and you put the title there, you can't help but thinking of things crawling up and down your arm.
Yeah.
But what interested me the most about the piece was using quarter tones, the glissandi you're using. Like, where did that come from, and why did you decide to do that?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I got to write for Jack Quartet, so I was like, I mean, So I feel like the first movement has especially a lot of quarter tones that I sort of thought of it more. Extra musical is not the right word, but I feel like maybe I thought of it more in terms of the shape and the gesture I want to go for, the perspective. And so the first movement is, I thought of it as sort of this perspective, this person looking at a group of insects, a swarm of insects from afar. And it's sort of very hazy. It's a lot of things. You can distinguish the individuals, and it's just like a swarm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the feeling and the sound I wanted. So I wanted that sense that each of the four instruments are kind of stuck together, and they're sort of an organic collective that is swelling and then not swelling. And, so I thought quarter tones in that kind of sonic world and the glissandos, that made the most sense. And that's sort of how so that was sort of my thought process, going from the thing I want to capture, whether it's sounds or an idea, and then going into how does that work? Like, what kind of musical world do I want to bring the listener into to convey that kind of thought I had?
Yeah. So when you're conceiving of these, so it's more about like the overall shape of it. It's not about, okay, yes, I want this F half sharp going to this F sharp going to this.
Yeah,
it's not about like, okay, these are the pitches that I like. Right?
Yeah, no, actually, I'm more of a I think in terms of approximates kind of person in composing. So I think of more, this is the movement registrally, and then this is the kind of shape I want, how intense I want it to be. But then maybe it could have been a F quarter sharp or like a G quarter sharp. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's another composer that I feel like maybe you can go in this direction at some point. Bethany Young, who at Columbia, I don't know if you know, but she does. You saying this reminds me of some of her scores, because she has these amazing illustrator scores where she would put the shape of the pitches on, but you don't know what the pitches necessarily are. But sometimes you do. Sometimes she would give pitches, but only when she really wants them.
Right.
But then there's moments where she gives the shape, and you can get quarter tones in there, you can get regular notes in there, or maybe she would write what the general like chromaticism of that line. And I wonder, for you in the future, I wonder if that would be something interesting, because then it would take off the pressure of choosing all those pitches,
right,
and give more agency to the performer to choose the pitches themselves. But then you get to that idea, then it becomes, okay, how comfortable is the performer choosing pitches and things kind of, but it adds another layer of intrigue, I feel like, especially if you have the right performer. Yeah.
Totally. I think the right performer like really is important in that kind of, at least for me, like from what I've experienced. But yeah.
When you were working with Jack Quartet, so in case, if you got this far, maybe you know what Jack Quartet is, but they're this group that they're just animals when it comes to just intonation, and not just intonation, but knowing exactly where on the fingerboard to put certain pitches. You tell them to play, 14 cents flat, they could do that. You tell them to play quarter tones, they could do that. You tell them to play double stops that are like, not a major six, but like a major six plus a quarter tone, they could do it. And I've worked with them too, and they sight read this piece that I wrote, which I thought was impossible to sight read, and they did it. And I was like, wait, how long did you guys practice this thing before? He said, oh, this is the first time we see it. I'm like,
wow,
how is that possible?
I feel like they're one of those groups that just like created a performance practice just by themselves.
That's what it's got to be.
Yeah.
Because I've worked with so many quartets, and they all take a long time to get into it. No fault of their own. They're all great quartets that I've worked with, but every time I put a microtone in front of them, it's like, wait, what do I do with this? Like, how am I supposed to listen to this?
Yeah.
Is it just supposed to sound like a wrong note? Or does it fall in some kind of like overall plan that you have? Like, did you choose that pitch on purpose? And at least in my music, there always is a reason I pick that pitch and that vertical sonority. But you know, in your, at least with that piece, it's more about the shape. But they were playing the notes. It didn't sound like they were just hitting a random note between F and F sharp. They were hitting the F half sharp, like right in the middle, you know, and it sounded like they were playing like a chromatic scale, that the 24 note chromatic scale when they're playing your piece. And I wonder what does that give you, like more confidence to go in that route, or does it give you the opposite? Like, they're the only ones that could do it. I'm not doing this again.
It's a paradoxical feeling of both.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It's you know, like the performers and ensembles like that gives so much more to our imaginations of what we can do. But at the same time, you're also like, but this is not everyone. And obviously I'm writing for people. I'm not writing for just my imagination. And I also really care about the collaboration aspect of composing, because really before you give your score to someone, it's all solitary. But then I think something else that I really like got into coming to college was being able to actually create with people. And sometimes it's like almost a co-creation. Like Return to Root, I worked with a visual artist friend, Sydney Lee, who created artwork based on the poem. And we sort of presented that together in the concert as a joint thing. And I love, and you know, also working with choreographers and talking about how the musical and the dance aspects can collide in a performance. And so, you know, like that part I really cherish. And similarly with working with performers, and sometimes having more collaboration, like kind of talking about the piece throughout. And sometimes it'll be more like, oh, like here's the piece. But like in both scenarios, there is a consideration for the other people involved. And so, you know, Jack Quartet, it's also like, not everyone's a Jack Quartet. Otherwise they wouldn't be, you know. So definitely both, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, when you write for an ensemble like Jack, you have to, you kind of feel like you have to take advantage of what they do. Otherwise, it's almost like, why are you writing for them? And I like working with them in particular because it gives me an avenue to be even more expressive, because otherwise I have a filter in my head. Okay, I can't do this. I can't do this. Like, for example, I don't know if you've written for orchestra yet, but when you write for an orchestra, it's like filter constantly. And it's like, okay, like I want to do this thing, but there's a filter in my head because I know, okay, I only have an hour of rehearsal if I'm lucky for that week. Like, what are the top 3 things I want to get out of this piece? All right, took the 3. Like, how do I make that the top 2 things? All right, how do I make it? What's my most important thing? And and that's what happens. Really, it becomes, what's the most important thing I can get out of this piece? And when you're working with an orchestra versus a Jack Quartet, or you know, working with the ensemble that you had at National Sawdust, it becomes less about the collaboration, more about, okay, how do I show my own expression in the simplest way possible? So I don't know. I think you mentioned to me that you wrote a piece for orchestra, but you don't have the recording yet.
Yes, so it's still no recording yet, exactly. Definitely, well, it's my first orchestra piece, so I think I will learn all of that the hard way.
Yes, you will. Trust me, you will.
I did do like bunch of string divisions. I'm literally working on the parts right now, and there's like 55
Good
parts.
luck.
But yeah, I think I try to be aware of that when I was writing, and it definitely is a genre, like a medium of its own. You know, there's a lot of limitations, but there's also so much. I guess I'm sure there's so much you can do with the scale of how much people there are, and sort of the conductor being a part of the ensemble, and that, like, the person being able to shape the music in some ways. But yeah, no, I mean, I feel like a big part of limitations for orchestral writing is rehearsal time, and that's just sadly like a logistical thing that composers have to deal with.
It's really rehearsal time. That's like the biggest thing. Who are you writing the piece for?
It's just a personal project.
A personal project, yeah. That's how I did my first orchestra piece too. It was like, well, nobody's commissioning this. I was 19, I think, when I wrote it. And but that's actually what you have to do, because I know a lot of people that don't write for the orchestra, and if you ask them, have you ever just wrote an orchestra piece, that most of them say no. But people that want to write for the orchestra, you really just have to write an orchestra piece to begin with and see if you even like doing it, because the number of staves, the decision making, the orchestration is another thing that you have to deal with, that's separate from orchestrating for a string quartet, or it's a completely different animal. So you might not even like doing that, which is totally fine. But I think writing, like having the initiative to write it, spend the time, I think is the way to go. At least that's how I did it. Like I had the initiative to write the piece. It did get played a few times. And then I said, I like that experience. Let me do it again. Let me do it again. Let me do it again. Before you know it, you'll have a bunch of orchestra pieces that kind of just magically appeared. But it has to start from that first one.
Yeah, no, I think what I love about the medium is that it's so much about color and, I mean, structure, obviously, orchestration, and all of that is like, I feel like when I was writing the orchestra piece, I was thinking so much more purely sonically. And whereas I feel like when I write a chamber piece and pieces with smaller ensembles, I tend to want to think about the physicality more, and also sort of, like a more embodied, not just purely musical kind of approach. That's how I tend to take. But I find it quite different when, you write for larger ensembles and smaller ensembles. The way you approach the process and how you write is slightly different as well.
So you were working with Andrew Norman on the orchestra piece?
Yeah.
So what was it like? Because he is he is the guy when it comes to orchestral music. I mean, what was it like in general, like this process? Because I've had a few conversations with Andrew, but most of them were not about music. Actually, it was more about life and in general and things like this. But what was it like taking lessons with him and doing this whole journey with a mentor like that? I mean, it must be.
I mean, incredible. I mean, Andrew is such a creative soul, but he's also so thoughtful, as a human being. I feel like, actually, it's interesting because I feel like for my lessons, I don't always just talk about music with him. Like there was a while when I wasn't able to write anything. And we just talked. Like we talked about music making, we talked about being a composer, but it's also more than that. It's not just like, oh, like how I'm gonna live, like how am I gonna apply to grad school? It's like not just that. We would talk about what do you feel like being a composer, why. He's really interested in the why and in the kind of slightly not quite the main compositional aspects. It's like we can look at music, and he will talk about it, and we would sort of discuss my music and analyze my music, but we would also talk about, why are you doing this and what's important to you outside of just arranging these sonic elements. So that approach to, I guess, like pedagogy and that approach to thinking about music and thinking about being a composer is really important to me.
I love that, because I've been thinking a lot about this too, the why. And I just had a lesson with one of my students. We were discussing this very thing, like, why are you writing this piece? And it sounds so trivial, but if you don't have that why, then it's almost like, how do you have the motivation to finish the piece? And I just started working on a piece a couple days ago. I was telling you off camera for Gdamis Festival. And literally, I went through like 10 different whys. And I finally found one that I liked, that I actually was excited to do, because you got to get up to write the piece. You got to work yourself up, and you have to be enthusiastic, because if you're not enthusiastic while you're writing the piece, it's just going to be a miserable experience. And I think that this is something I learned from Georg Friedrich Haas, believe it or not, that you have to love the process, like actually love it, not just fake it. I mean, and that's very challenging. And I have to say, it wasn't until maybe like a couple years ago before I started like actually loving the process. Because before that, I absolutely hated it. I would dread going into the practice room and writing, and I absolutely hated it. I'm like, I like the result of what I'm doing, fine, but I'm not enjoying this process. And how is there like a mindset that I have to do to change that, or is this just how it's going to be? And I didn't accept that. So I think this is related to what Andrew is telling you, but I'm just kind of going off of it. This is such an important thing as you get older, I feel, to cultivate, because otherwise just thinking about the result is is not enough. I think of it like I watch a lot of basketball. I don't know if you're into sports, but
I actually played basketball in
oh
middle
really?
school and high school.
No way.
Yeah.
Okay, I love basketball.
It's
That's
great.
like,
Yeah.
but I watch all these guys. I watch a lot of basketball podcasts, and I hear like what they're going through during the season. So when they talk, it's not just at the end of the season after everything is done. They're talking about their journey. They're talking about training. They're talking about getting up to practice. They're talking about the games, and they're like in it. But when you are a sports fan or a basketball fan or whatever, all you care about is the end result, like whether they win a championship or not.
Mm.
And I think of it in the same way with composition, because to me, like when we have a performance, especially at a venue that we really wanted to be at, like let's say National Sawdust, for example, like to us, that's our championship game. But it's not just about that. It was about the whole process going up to that point. And if you just enjoy that last part when you win the ring or whatever, like that's not enough. Maybe it's enough in the beginning when you're really young, but when you get older, I don't feel like that. Like sometimes I come away from a performance and I'm just like so exhausted from the writing process that it's like not like it's like the feeling I'm hoping for that dopamine hit, but I don't get it because I haven't been cultivating it during the writing process. So I'm still actively working on that, but at least now I'm like cognizant that that's what I need for this to work long term, into my 30s. Now in my 30s, hopefully into my 40s, hopefully into my 50s. So this is kind of the theme I've been talking about actually the last few shows.
That's certainly really interesting. I'm sure it's like, it's like a marathon almost, like figuring out your process. Like for me, it's it's still relatively new. I've done it for a few years. Collaboration has really only come since college. Before college, I would go to summer festivals, and that was very different. It was like you deliver a piece before you even know who the performers are. So I think the past 2 or 3 years has been me figuring out what my process is and externalizing and articulating it to myself and to other people sometimes. But that has been, interesting. But of course, like I'm not always gonna, like my relationship with my process is gonna change, and my process might change too. And so I don't know, like I'll see.
That's the exciting part.
Yeah.
So this is what I didn't realize when I was doing my undergrad or my master's, especially. Like I didn't realize that that's the fun of it. Like to see the change and to see, and because there's people that they withdraw their pieces, and I just don't really believe in that. I said that's who you were when you were that age, or maybe you're a little older and you had a piece that you didn't like but you want to withdraw. No, that's who you were. Maybe you were going through a difficult time, or maybe you didn't have time to write the piece. But that was you. That's the truth. That was you in 2020. That was you in 2018. Whatever. Like that was you, and that's the truth. And I really believe in that. Or maybe I'll shoot myself in the foot if I withdraw one of my pieces. Somebody can go back and take this excerpt out. But I really believe that it's the process, it's the change in the process, and it's being as enthusiastic as you can make yourself to be to write the piece. Because otherwise, what else is it?
Yeah, I agree.
This got a lot heavier than I thought it was going to be, but it's fun. Thanks so much for coming by.
Thank you for having me.
Check out her music down in the description below. I put those 2 full pieces down and her website, so please check it out. Thanks so much.
Thank you.